While we're on this black screen, I want to do a sort of experiment with you. Imagine the feeling of emptiness as it pertains to art. It's not quite the same as nothingness, although, depending on your definition, perhaps it could be. When I think of emptiness, though, I imagine it somewhat different to pure nothingness. I think of liminal spaces, long hallways, deserted streets, the feeling of something ominous and yet comforting, foreboding yet inviting, melancholy and mysterious. When I was a kid in my elementary art class, I remember the teacher placing this picture by Italian artist Giorgio de Chirico in the center of the table I was sitting at. I don't remember any lesson that came from the painting, just the feelings it gave me as I looked at it. Gazing at the empty street, the looming shadow of a statue or approaching person in the distance. The lone girl playing with a wheel, cast in silhouette and somehow appearing just as distant as the shadow. This is, quite possibly, one of the most striking paintings I've ever seen, because in the 20+ years since I was in that class, I've never quite gotten it out of my head. This feeling of looking at something that feels real and dreamlike, beautiful and intimidating. The dusk-lit streets and striking shadows, vacant yet full of life. This feeling is where I base my definition of emptiness as it pertains to art, caught between a mixture of admiration, melancholy, and longing. And now that pretentious nonsense is out of the way, Princess Aretha Franklin, is a 2001 animated film based on the 1983 book The Clever Princess by Diana Coles. It tells the story of the titular princess, confined to a tower by her father, until a suitor can prove themselves worthy of her hand. Little does he or the ministers of the kingdom know, Aretha frequently sneaks into town to see the common folk living their lives and performing their daily routines. Taking a great interest in the outside world, Aretha tires of her solitary life and tries to sneak away, but is caught by the guards and returned to the castle. By chance, a wizard named Boax arrives the same day and asks for Aretha's hand in marriage, claiming her independent streak is really a curse and curing her of it. The ministers and king agree to the marriage, and Boax whisks Aretha away to his castle, where she is to remain in yet another solitary confinement for the rest of her life, lest she fulfill an ancient prophecy that will result in Boax's eternal life being taken away.
永遠を約束されたこの俺の命がアリーテという名の小娘のために縮められてしまうと
Keep your friends close and your prophesized doombringer closer, I guess. The film was made by Studio 4 Degrees Celsius, a Japanese studio who most normie anime consumers like myself might know from the various anthology films they've contributed to, like The Animatrix or Batman Gotham Knight, as well as handling a number of outsourced scenes in various TV shows. They've produced their own feature-length films from time to time as well, the most notable probably being the Berserk Golden Age Arc trilogy. Princess Aretha was one of their first major independent productions, and remains somewhat obscure to Western audiences 20 years since its debut. This is understandable, as it never had a wide release in the US, or even an English dub. But still, to those who find it, it's something of a hidden gem in the anime community. I first saw it several years back when it was on Netflix for a brief period, and I've often thought that it would be a pretty good basis for a video on YouTube. A sentiment that only a handful of people seem to agree with. Well, I've got a YouTube channel with a fairly decent subscriber count now, so let's do it. Going back to my definition of emptiness as it pertains to art, much of Princess Aretha's life is defined by the same kind of feeling. A sense of longing to explore the world, an admiration for the people who craft great things, and an overbearing sense of melancholy that, as long as she is expected to fill out her role as princess, she can never do either herself.
本物の魔法使いのものとは違うけれど、その手には確かに魔法のようなものが備わっている。だっ としたらこの手にも。
No, Arit's life was chosen for her long before she was even born, to be a prize for a worthy suitor and secure the bloodline of the kingdom, to remain isolated in her tower, even after she is married, to sit there and look pretty while the world turns around her. Arit recognizes her lot in life, and slowly becomes aware of just how similar this lot is with the other people in court. The king, who barely says a word to anyone, let alone his daughter, goes through the motions of his role, while the suitors bring many lavish gifts of gold and parlor magic that the kingdom's ministers tuck away to be sold later.
姫君の心を射止める最も素晴らしい宝を持ち帰るのはこのダラボアと決めているのです。
そうしてまた大臣たちは魔法の宝を手に入れる。この人だって私と同じ。
Even when Arit calls out this connection, this never-ending cycle of empty obedience, no one really takes her seriously. She's but a fair maiden after all, an object to be saved and protected, not a person with her own aspirations or feelings. When it seems like the familiarity of her life will be shaken at the introduction of the wizard Boix, he merely locks her up in his decrepit tower dungeon to live out the rest of her days in solitude, where he can keep a better eye on her, placing her in the same prison she's been in her entire life, just in a less glamorous location, complete with other souls who are equally trapped as she is. The nearby village relies on the wizard's sorcery to give them water, with his only request being someone to come up and bring him meals throughout the day. But the wizard's power isn't like real magic. He relies on tokens and items to do the work for him, with the only bit of magic he truly learned being his ability to transform people or creatures into other beings or objects. He can't let on that he has any sort of weakness, however, and is quick to lash out against those who demand a more serious type of magic from him.
素晴らしい魔法使いの国の料理ってのを出してみてくださいよ。
貴様いつから偉そうな口を聞けるようになった？
If it wasn't painfully obvious just from my description, one of the major themes of Princess Arit is the control powerful men exert over those weaker than them. The ministers in the kingdom who keep sending suitors after valuable objects to amass their own wealth. The one-sided deal Boix strikes with the village to supply them just enough water to sustain themselves, while still being dependent on him. And with this theme of control comes the out-and-out feminist message this movie wears on its sleeve. Of course, there's been plenty of feminist deconstruction on the stereotypical role of the princess or damsel in distress in media discussion in the past 30-odd years or so, gaining traction around the time companies like Disney were starting to become more self-aware of the various tropes they helped cultivate in the cultural zeitgeist for better...
Oh, Giselle! We shall be married in the morning.
Or worse.
Oh my, this is a twist on our story. It's the brave little princess coming to the rescue.
Or even worse.
I will be silent.
Or just plain obnoxious.
Do you have magic hair?
No.
Magic hands?
No.
Do animals talk to you?
No.
Were you poisoned?
No.
Cursed?
No. Kidnapped or
What helps Princess Arit in its feminist deconstruction is that it isn't winking and nudging at the audience even during its more satirical moments. It instead focuses on examining the patriarchal systems of the kingdom and Boax's tower, and asking the question of what true freedom really means. Before she's taken away by Boix, Arit meets a witch who wanders into the castle looking for a crystal that was taken from her, the key to her magic and eternal life. She strikes an engaging conversation with Arit, more engaging than the ones she had with her would-be suitors anyway.
Checkmate.
And the young princess's curiosity and optimism towards life bemuses the jaded old witch. This pessimistic outlook is shared by Boix, who spends his unlimited time on Earth merely moping about his tower and reflecting on memories of when there were more wizards like him in the world. lying down with his head in the past rather than rising to meet the future. Where he and the witch differ is that, after some time to accept the inevitability of her fate, the witch departs from the castle to live out her days as a regular person, saying she'll even forget her old life in the process, and imparting a magic ring to Arit that will give her 3 wishes. Though Arit's mind is still her own, the transformation Boax put upon her is strong enough that she doesn't automatically wish herself free. She instead uses her first 2 wishes on making her new room more hospitable, and on sewing tools to weave tapestries, resigning herself to the dungeon while, at the same time, trying to give herself just a little bit of freedom.
何もすることのないここで心が退屈を覚えているのでしょう。
The villager tasked to bring Boax his food, Ample, tells her to imagine a fairy tale in her head to help her pass the time. A fairy tale that she has complete control of. Arit imagines her own life and the people she observed. How each of them were the heroes in their own story, but her own story felt completely out of her control. That she was never the hero, merely a passive observer in her own life. Yet, through it all, she still held on to a passion for living, an aspiration to break free from the emptiness that consumed her existence. Because to believe that life has some greater purpose beyond merely existing. When I first saw Princess Arit, the rush of feelings I had experienced when I first saw Melancholy and Mystery crept back into my mind with each scene that passed. That feeling of experiencing something so masterfully crafted and meticulous in every detail, off-putting yet thought-provoking. And most odd of all, it reminded me of a video game I'd played a few years prior. Ico is a video game released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2, directed by Fumito Ueda, and developed by Japan Studio and Team Ico. It tells the story of the titular Ico, a boy from an unknown village who is deemed cursed due to the horns on his head. He's brought to a mysterious and large castle overlooking the sea, where he is entombed by his fellow villagers to hopefully sate the curse. Waking from a nightmare not long after, Ico breaks free and soon finds a fellow prisoner in the form of a young girl named Yorda. Though the two can't understand each other, not if you don't have a completed save file anyway, Ico quickly steps up as the girl's protector from terrifying shadows that appear after she is released from her cage. And the two try to find a way out of the castle, and away from the terrible queen who resides there, bearing evil intent for Ico and her supposed daughter, Yorda. Ico is perhaps equally as obscure as Princess Arit in the grand scheme of things, though it holds an equally beloved status among those who have played it. It performed poorly in North America when it first released due to a lack of marketing, and this atrocious cover art probably didn't help. I mean, good lord, that is just putrid. But was able to find better success when it and its spiritual successor/prequel Shadow of the Colossus were released on PlayStation 3 in 2011. And though Shadow of the Colossus has largely eclipsed Ico in terms of status and popularity, even getting a complete remake on PlayStation 4 back in 2018, Ico remains a monumental piece of influence. Games like Dark Souls, The Last of Us, Journey, Twilight Princess, and countless more owe part of their design, gameplay, or a little bit of both to Ico. And director Guillermo del Toro frequently calls it and Colossus a deep well of inspiration in his own work, and a masterpiece in its own right. That's all very well, but at first glance it probably doesn't seem like it has much to do with an obscure anime movie released around the same time, right? Well, yeah, I admit it might be a bit of a stretch to form any concrete connection between the two, especially since they'd both be in development around the same time, so no intentional influence would bleed over. But it's not so much the similarity in these two stories, as it is the feeling each one gives me. That abstract feeling of emptiness I keep bringing up. And where Iko has the advantage in this regard is that, rather than merely observing it, I got to experience it. As I wandered the imposing halls of the impossibly large castle with Iko and Yorda, I was taken aback at how distant everything was. The camera was always framed in such a way that it seemed to be looking down at the two prisoners, watching them, leering at them, as they tried the impossible and hopeless task of escaping. I felt uneasy and claustrophobic in every expansive chamber, a cold and chilling mood permeating each room as more aggressive shadow creatures came to steal Yorda away, dragging her to some dark unknown as punishment for trying to defy her fate. The only source of true comfort in this hauntingly beautiful horror was the simple act of holding Yorda's hand, keeping her close as we navigated each room and solved each puzzle, taking some respite when we needed. Coming back from a loaded save file to see the two sleeping soundly, as if the terrible reality of their situation weren't present everywhere they went. Apart from the shadow creatures and the rare appearance of the queen herself, there are no other characters in the game apart from Iko and Yorda, giving the game a deep sense of intimacy as you grow closer to Yorda with every puzzle you come across, every gap you jump, every helpful hint she provides, which only serves to make the second act twist where all of your progress is ripped from your fingertips all the more sour. There's an equally melancholic feeling in Iko as there is in Princess Arit. The story of a child or children who want so desperately to escape the life they were thrown into, the life they had no choice but to accept. The desire for freedom, so close they could literally almost touch it, only to be tossed back into their respective prisons, back into that overbearing emptiness with seemingly no hope of escape. Yet for all the trials and trickery they encounter, they press forward, defiantly acting against their oppressors and aspiring for more. Because isn't it natural to want more out of life? Team Iko's brief but masterful trilogy of games, Iko, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian, all explore near-barren landscapes that evoke a deep sense of emptiness in me. However, I brought up Iko specifically due to its more blatant connection with the very first piece of art I can remember that evoked that sense in me. For the Japanese and European releases of the game, Fumito Ueda drew a piece of cover art that specifically evoked the work of Giorgio de Chirico, namely the nostalgia of the infinite, and you could be forgiven for thinking that the Italian master drew it himself. It depicts one of the more memorable set pieces of the game, the windmill, with Iko and Yorda running off in the distance, their shadows cast behind them. It's as striking a piece of art as any of the paintings de Chirico made, and tells the complete story of Iko all by itself. Princess Arit features quite a bit more characters than a typical de Chirico painting or Fumito Ueda game, but features many scenes that evoke the style of both for me. Overhead and distant shots that seem to leer at Arit. Striking shadows and landscapes bathed in a warm light. And one more feeling that all three examples provide in me that, up until now, I hadn't really put to words. Envy. Envy that three works so beautifully realized, so masterfully crafted could be made by human hands. It makes me realize all the more that I want to create something too. Something that can speak a myriad of emotions into anyone who experiences it, no matter what that creation is. But do I even dare try? Is there a point to putting myself out there when my efforts could be tossed aside and ignored so easily? That feeling of emptiness that I described before, a mixture of admiration, melancholy, and longing, is a feeling I know all too well. The admiration in a certain piece of art that inspires me to create. The melancholy it leaves when I inevitably get too wrapped up in my own head about its imperfections. The longing that I wish I could actually create something of my own. It's a cycle that repeats itself over and over and over again, often making me feel trapped in my own mind. A mind that feels as impenetrable as a far-off dungeon in a castle. Life is so impossibly difficult and full of hardships. Why even bother trying to put yourself out there? Isn't it better to just coast through life, doing only what is expected of you? Never striving for anything above your station, because what can someone like me really offer to the world? But still, I aspire to create. I continue to gather inspiration and chip away at my ideas little by little, slowly working towards my freedom. We all want to experience more in life than merely living it. Because, after all, isn't that natural?
1000年もの時を飛び越えてすごい魔法が詰まってるのよ。人のここには忘れないで。同じ魔法はあなただけでなく誰の中にも備わっているんだということを。じゃあ
Of course, there's been plenty of feminist deconstruction on the stereotypical role of the princess or damsel in distress in media discussion and pop culture in the past 30-odd years or so. Jesus Christ, why do you make such long sentences?